And say hello again. Hi everyone, welcome to Agile Expertise. I'm Sital, and I'm pleased to announce that Dean will be talking to us about the Cynefin framework, but the extension of the Cynefin framework, and that is a point of Aporia. It's a really interesting concept, and Dean and I were having a conversation about it recently, and there's a lot of realizations that we could potentially find ourselves in a situation where we want to tell organizations that we're at this point, but it's hard to describe. And actually, I think Aporia describes it perfectly. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dean, and I will also assign him as host so he can control the slides. Where are you, Dean? Let me just let someone in first. We have Akash joining us. So Dean, I will ask you if you could just make sure that when people want to be admitted, you let them in as well.
Sure.
Because I'm making you host. Are you able to screen share? Because then otherwise I can do that.
I will be screen sharing. Yeah, let me start screen share now.
Yeah.
Just to make sure that works. Just bear with me.
Hi Akash, by the way. Welcome.
Hello.
Okay, if you're screen sharing and you're okay with that, then I can keep letting people in the background. So
yeah, great. Okay, so everyone should be seeing the first slide of a small deck that I've put together. Let me know if you're not seeing a slide. Sital, thank you for the welcome, and thank you everyone for coming along this evening. So this is not really a talk or a presentation. It's an opportunity to have a discussion to talk about a particular update to the Cynefin framework. For some of us, the framework may be quite new, or we may want a reminder. So I'm going to be spending a few moments just going quickly through the framework, and then I'm going to Sital and I are going to loosely facilitate a discussion. And it's going to include a moment where we're going to use a Zoom feature to break out into breakout rooms, and then we're going to spend around 10 minutes in those rooms just thinking about how Aporia is applicable to us at an individual level, perhaps a team level, maybe an organizational level, and also from, if we think about some of the unprecedented times that are affecting individuals and also up to a global scale, how Aporia could be applicable to government policy, healthcare, how organizations can navigate this really quite extraordinary times that we're living in at the moment. So feel free to ask questions. If you've got any observations, any thoughts, any challenges that we want to present each other. This is a safe space, I hope, and we can learn through open dialogue. So I would encourage that as much as possible. Okay, so what you're now seeing on the screen is the latest iteration of the Cynefin framework. And as many of us know, this is a sense-making framework which has been conceived of by Dave Snowden, who has a big presence in the Lean Agile community. And behind that is the Cognitive Edge consultancy as well, which he set up with a number of other people as well. This evening's focus is looking at Aporia, and just a very, very quick introduction to Aporia. Aporia, with confused, is the new name given to the fifth domain, which used to be called disorder. Looking at Aporia, the definition of Aporia, there's a number of different definitions, but I find it quite useful to think about it as a state that we may be in where there's doubts, there's paradoxes, maybe we're puzzled to know which way to go forward. And again, we can think about this from a individual level all up to an organizational level, or even a national level. And as I've mentioned already, this is a really timely adjustment to the sense-making framework, and I hope this is going to become apparent through discussion this evening. So This evening is going to be discussion format. It's going to be roughly 60 minutes, maybe a bit more. Let's see it. Let's play it by ear. And the format, loosely facilitated by Sital and I, open discussion. And the things we're going to go through is a quick introduction to the Cynefin framework, some other changes to the Cynefin framework which you may be aware of, introduction to Aporia, and then think about some of the contexts, contemporary contexts where Aporia could be applicable. And I think it might be quite powerful if we have a bit of divergent thinking. We break out into different Zoom breakout rooms. We spend around 10 minutes just discussing that in our small groups. Then we'll come back to the main room where each group will discuss their thinking. And then penultimately, we'll have a look at some potential applications, and we'll do that in the main room. We won't do a breakout for that because I think hopefully we'll get to a position where we're comfortable having an open discussion collectively. And then we'll close. So I'm just going to pause there in case there's any questions before going into the introduction to Cynefin, or maybe there's any kind of housekeeping or technical things which need to be sorted. So feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat facility to share some thinking. Okay, let's move on. So let's do the introduction to the Cynefin framework. Actually, before I move on, I'd like to give a bit of background to my understanding of complexity thinking and the Cynefin framework. I learned about the Cynefin framework around 5 years ago, and I find it a really fascinating tool to be able to examine the world, to make sense of my place in the world. I wouldn't say I'm an expert in complexity thinking, neither would I say I'm an expert in the Cynefin framework, but I think I've put together a body of knowledge which is ready to share with other people to create a platform where we can all debate each other. So if you have a different interpretation of the Cynefin framework, again, feel free to unmute yourself and share your thinking as well. Nonetheless, this is an introduction to the framework. So I'm going to build up stage by stage, and we can think about the Cynefin framework in two halves or two hemispheres. There's a right-hand side and a left-hand side. The right-hand side is made up of two domains where we feel that there's a relationship between cause and effect. If we do something or we allow something to happen, we have enough experience or insight to know what the outcome's going to be. On the left-hand side are the disordered domains. This is where the relationship between cause and effect isn't apparent up front, and perhaps it's only known in retrospect after the occurrence has happened, or maybe the relationship between cause and effect is not knowable. And then there's also the fifth domain as well. So the fifth domain, as I mentioned, used to be called disordered. It's now called Aporia, confused, and we're going to go into that this evening. But first of all, let's think about the other four domains. And I put together a few fun examples to help illustrate each of those domains. So the obvious domain is the first one. And let's suppose that we're a pub manager who's looking after a pub. We've got customers and we've got our staff. So this scenario here is a pub manager. A customer walks up to the bar and asks for a particular beer, a particular pint of beer. That's a fairly obvious response to that. We've done this kind of thing 10,000 times before. The environment hasn't changed, so we'll be able to serve that customer quite easily, fulfill that transaction. So the decision model here is that we sense the facts, we categorize, and we respond. The solution is self-evident. If we're thinking about software or digital product development, if the team feels that the environment hasn't changed and they've done this thing 10,000 times before, this opportunity or this problem is a candidate for automation. Next example, looking at the complicated domain. Again, let's suppose you're a pub manager and you want to serve a new type of draft beer, which is different to previous types of draft beer. Perhaps it's something like an extra cold one, which is chilled to a lower temperature. Here it's not obvious how to serve that beer and how to maintain it. So here we may need to call upon an expert, perhaps from the brewery. So we need to sense the fact, analyze, and then respond to be able to deal with this opportunity. This tends to be the realm of experts. or where we need to do some analysis before we know how to respond. So that's a complicated domain. Complex domain, again, let's suppose we're a pub manager and we want to be able to choose the best types of beer. We're now going into the summer months, and let's suppose we want to be able to complement our beers with a new food menu for the summer. Here, because the answer isn't obvious immediately, we may need to run some experiments. We need to probe, sense, and then respond appropriately. So we may want to run some experiments where we're getting customer feedback. We're doing some taste testing where we're trying to complement different types of beer with different menu items. So the solution here is emergent. We only know the right answer through probing by running safe to fail experiments. So this is an important quality of operating in the complex domain, is that we want to be able to run rapid experiments, quite often lots of parallel experiments. We haven't spent all the money for the project, or we've only spent a small proportion of time and energy or resources to be able to know that we can actually pivot and go in a different direction as we gather insight and new information from our customers or stakeholders. The fourth domain, this is the Celtic domain. Again, we're a pub manager, and for some unknown reason, customers are beginning to complain and want to complain about a particular type of beer. We don't know the reason why this is happening, but what we need to do if we're a good pub manager is respond immediately to perhaps apologize to the customer, turn off that tap, give them a refund, maybe give them some vouchers for the restaurant as way of apologizing for a bad beer. We have no time to be able to find out what the root cause or the root causes of that bad beer is. We need to act immediately, sense, and then respond to stabilize the situation after. And then perhaps afterwards, we can actually do some analysis, do some investigation as to why that particular beer was dreadful. So those are the four domains. And I'll pause there in case there's any questions or whether there's any additions that people want to build upon what I've shared so far. Okay, doesn't sound like it. So again, this is the reminder of the latest iteration of the Kinetic framework. And you can see here, a few months ago, the framework was illustrated like this. In fact, if you go to the Wikipedia page of the framework, you'll see the image in the bottom right-hand corner. So I'd like to mention some other changes to the framework. So there was always an understanding that the Cynefin framework wasn't a categorization framework. So there are situations which we cannot firmly place smack bang in the middle of one of these domains. There's always a degree of liminality or a change in state where something could be transitioning, say, from the complex domain into the complicated domain. So, for example, if going back to that example of the pub manager, we now have enough information and confidence to know how to suggest complements between a certain beers and a food menu item. So we can actually move into the complicated domain here and present a menu. And this is where we're tightening constraints. We are now moving from emergent practice into good practice. So this is more heavily or more visually illustrated with this liminality here. So this is where we have this gradient from the green to the black here. So we can actually operate legitimately in this space here and transition between these two different domains. Another change is obvious, has now become clear. And this emergent practice is now called exaptive. So exaptive is where we repurpose something for another purpose. So we have this tool, operation, product or service, something that we may have used a lot in the past, and we've discovered that we can actually repurpose it for something else. And this is something which no doubt has been very prevalent with the rise of COVID. And what Dave Snowden often says is that when it comes to innovation, rapid innovation, sometimes we cannot go completely back to the drawing board. We want to re-examine what's available, what is acceptable, and perhaps we can repurpose that for another cause. And then finally, as we've mentioned already, the disordered domain, the fifth domain, is now Aporia confused. So I'd like to touch on the difference between Aporia and confused. And this is stuff that I've gathered through blog posts that I've read from some thought leaders and some people from Cognitive Edge. So I'm just going to read out what one of them has said. So Aporia means at a loss and indicates an unresolved confusion or a paradox, which is just fine. So that means it actually could be quite a legitimate stance to be in, to recognize and share and be open that we are confused. There is a paradox. We don't, and that's an honest place to be. We shouldn't feel unduly pressured to be able to move into one of the other domains, one of the other Cynefin domains. Sometimes things need to remain a little murky for a while. So we don't want to be forced into premature convergence into thinking of what the solution is. So let's compare that to confused. Confused refers to a state of mind where we are just not getting it. We just don't understand the problem. It's often the result of a failure to see past one's own biases, habits, and entrained patterns of solving problems. So confused is where we just don't understand the nature of the problem. Whereas Aporia is we do understand the nature of the problem, but we're choosing to remain there to perhaps gather new insight, more information. Maybe there's breaking news before we choose to make a decision and operate in one of the other domains. So again, feel free to ask questions or share some insights or some thoughts on that before I move on.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to quickly add a few things here, Dean, and I think it's just reflective of the conversations we had yesterday about Aporia, just to understand it slightly better. And I think a lot of us have probably experienced Aporia with the whole lockdown and the COVID-19 situation, I suppose. And one of them being that, you know, you'll respond very quickly to certain things, but then on other things you're like, okay, you know what, that can stay and wait. But you still don't really know what the outcomes are. Is that right, Dean? Is that where we're going with this?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a place. In fact, if I go to the next slide here, there's some really interesting quotes which ties into what you're saying there, Chital. So Chris Corrigan says that to be in Aporia, so you know, it's a state of puzzlement and doubt. It allows us to confront paradoxes and situations that have no resolution, no precedent, and no right way forward. So I think this ties into what you're saying.
Yeah.
Zhen, who's at Cognitive Edge, says Aporia provides a safe and curious vantage point for leaders. So leaders, I believe, have a tendency to be able to make quick decisions and to show action, and to which is all well and good if the situation is right. But sometimes it may be more beneficial for a leader to say simply, "I do not know. I do not have the answer. I want to be open." And I want to be able to canvass other people's opinion because I want to not be the all-seeing, all-knowing leader. And I think as the world becomes more and more complex and more interconnected and faster paced, it's more and more likely that a leader is not going to know how to deal with particular situations. These paradoxes are going to present themselves all the time. So it's, as Zhen says, it's a safe and curious vantage point for leaders and us as individuals to place ourselves.
Yeah, and I think in this instance, I think even the leaders were kind of set into a state of Aporia, because actually, how do you handle something that's so unexpected? You know, and I think this is what's coming to the surface right now, is that, you know, even our leaders were not sure which direction to take, and obviously having to reassure the public in such a state of puzzlement, as you said here, would have been quite profound for them.
Absolutely, thank you.
Okay, let's move on. So, what is the difference between Aporia and the chaotic domain? Some of us may be wondering, and I thought this as well when I first learned about Aporia a few weeks ago. So, being in Aporia is to acknowledge that we don't fully understand the nature of the situation. And it differs from the chaotic domain, since being in the chaotic domain is where we know we need to act immediately to stabilize the situation. So I've got an example here from a few weeks ago that many of us were witnessing, or perhaps we felt we were in this position. So before I give this example, it's actually legitimate, it's actually true, and probably happens more often than we think, that we can actually operate in more than one place at the same time. So we could be operating in Aporia, have a stance in Aporia, but also have a stance in chaotic, which the next example I hope is going to reveal. So a few weeks ago, many individuals in many nations, as the lockdown was being imposed, chose to buy lots and lots of toilet roll. It seemed to be a thing a couple of months ago. And for some of us to do so, we needed to employ some novel practices. Perhaps there could have been some people who had never done online shopping before, never used eBay, and they're doing so because they've realized they go to their local supermarket, they've shopped around, there just simply isn't any toilet roll anymore. So they want to be able to, there's a sense of desperation. They want to be able to act quickly before they feel they're going to run out of toilet roll. So they are operating in the chaotic domain. However, there could be decisions which they may want to defer or never take. So here they're in the Aporia domain. An example here is that some of us may have been holding train season tickets, maybe for the year. And so 2 months ago, we may not have had confidence of how the lockdown was going to unfold, what the government guidelines and advice was. Perhaps it's best to hold on to our season ticket because the lockdown may only be for a couple of weeks, and we don't want to go to the expense of applying for a refund. So here, I believe it would have been legitimate for a lot of us to be hold that decision, and because we're in a state of Aporia. So here, if we did make that decision, perhaps for many of us that would have been a better practice decision to do, because we've done that before and the environment hasn't changed, and we just go about making that decision. But initially, we may not have wanted to make that decision. Is that clear to everybody? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions, and maybe you could offer a different example as well.
Maybe one question to the toilet roll. If the toilet roll is an example for the chaotic space, that means that I need toilet roll immediately, or how does the toilet roll compare or help me to distinguish between Aporia and chaotic?
Yeah, so the decision is that we've made a choice, or an individual's made a choice to be able to get toilet roll immediately by any reasonable means possible. So here, whereas with, say, getting a season ticket refund, we don't know enough information to make a choice how to respond with whether we should actually apply for a refund. So we're gonna hold that decision in Aporia. We just don't have enough information yet.
I think to add to that, I think also there could be an element of the herd effect. Like, you know, everyone's hoarding toilet roll, so there must be something about toilet roll that we all need to go and hoard it. You know, I think it's a natural human behavior as well. And it's, you know, if I'm going to put it into perspective, it's the same with implementing Agile into your organization. You know, everyone else is doing it, so maybe we should be doing it too. So it's kind of like following the leader almost, but then also having a realization of all the other things you have to do. Dean, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, absolutely, and that herd mentality. Perhaps we want to have more information, more triggers, stronger suggestions, or stronger evidence before we follow the herd. We don't want to, as a CIO, perhaps I don't want to jump on the bandwagon and do an agile transformation. I actually want to understand what problems do I have and my department have, and how could agile transformation or something else actually address those problems? So I'm not going to be persuaded and go to market to get a big consultancy on board to actually implement this transformation.
So from that perspective, would we say that accepting by saying we are in a place of aporia where we're not sure what's going on yet, is it fair to say that that's where we should be in this instance? So rather than follow the herd and take the herd effect?
Yes, absolutely. That's a legitimate place to be.
Okay.
Definitely.
Thanks, that's good.
Yeah.
Then I have a question, if you don't mind. One of the beauty of this picture, at least in the first revision, was it's sorts of steps that you have between one area and the other that probably you naturally tend to follow, from complicated to complex and chaotic and then back to clear. Now, this area, aporia, that is not, it's like a multi-dimensional level, right? Where it does not obey to any simple rule. So you can move technically and you can be in aporia and chaotic at the same time, and you don't know probably at the beginning. Now, my question is about, to some extent, one of the beauty of this framework is to explain or give a structure about complexity. But if we introduce aporia, we don't have an understandable structure anymore. What I mean by that is anything can happen, right? So how can we use the framework technically to understand and move forward? I mean, the practices are well located in each single area, like complicated, complex, and chaotic and clear. If I'm there, I can eventually actually try to go with some novel practice or trying just to probe instead of doing other things or an experiment. But if I'm in aporia or I can be anywhere, what am I gonna do?
Yeah, I hear you. There isn't any, at least on the framework, it doesn't suggest how to operate in this space. Whereas, if I'm understanding you, in the complex domain, there is a suggestion of the practice of how to operate, or the decision model, probe, sense, respond. Whereas in aporia, there isn't, and perhaps the thinking hasn't developed far enough yet.
But I think in each quadrant you've got a kind of level of direction, haven't you? So like either probe, sense and respond, or sense, analyze and respond, or categorize and respond, or act, sense and respond. And I think, if we use COVID-19, for example, as an example, there was a response of acting, sensing and responding. Does that make sense? So I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the state of aporia, when you're in center, you could still refer to the quadrants to then guide you to where you need to be in terms of when you're going to kind of analyze where you're at to where you want to get to.
Is it a awareness and a holding place to actually move on to one of those other areas?
Yes, yeah, I think that's a legitimate way that's a legitimate way of thinking about it or making use of it. In my mind, what I'm recognizing is many situations start off in aporia, and I haven't done the exercise of actually kind of analyzing my thinking, but I think most of the time, me personally, I'm in aporia most of the time, and it's a legitimate stance to be in.
Dina, maybe it's useful to introduce here the way that you actually work with the Cynefin framework when you use it as a sense-making tool. So when you use it as a sense-making tool, it means that you first throw in everything that you understand and you see about the situation, and you accept that the situation probably will contain elements of all four or several of the quadrants. Any situation may have something which is clear, may have something which is complicated, but a lot of things which are complex, for example. And so what you do is you first put all the information, the things that you have observed onto the board, and you're not sure yet where they belong. And so slowly you think, which is the most, it's actually called the 4 points exercise, which is the element of all these that I see which most corresponds to what we understand to be clear. What is the one which most corresponds to what we understand to be complicated and complex and chaotic, if you find? And as a consequence, only then you have to think of these 4 quadrants as something growing in from the corner. So now you have very small areas in the corners which contain these 1 element each, maybe, and everything else is aporia. And so slowly think, oh, but this one actually also looks quite like it's being clear, or this one actually also looks like it's being complicated. And so this area grows, and the part in the middle becomes smaller and smaller. So every understanding of a system starts with everything being an aporia, and you have no idea, and then you start creating an idea. And so slowly, as these areas start filling up with observations and with elements, the part in the middle becomes smaller. And what's I think big, also a learning for many people, is there will always remain a part in the middle which you don't understand, that you don't know where to place that thing. There are reasons why it should be seen as complicated, but also reasons why it should be seen as complex, and therefore you're not sure. And that's what I believe how you can better understand aporia as a state, and how it's also it's easier to make a difference to chaotic, because in chaotic, yes, in a chaotic situation there's a lot of stuff that you don't understand, but you know that you're in a chaotic situation. In aporia, you don't know which of these 4 other domains you're in.
Yeah, and I also think if you take an example of how we learn, so if we are looking at ourselves in the mirror and we're trying to better ourselves, we have an awareness that we want to do something, but we don't know how to do it. So we're in that state of working out how we want to go about that.
I stand to agree with all of you guys on this note. I mean, whenever we're starting, say for example, a new product or a new project delivery, that's where we start. We start in a place where we don't really know much, but as we go on in exploring, we start to learn a bit more about it, don't we?
What I'm showing, let me know if you can see a change in my screen here, is that just following up on what Bernard says here, is that the 4-point contextualization exercises, where we do, as you're saying, how we may have a new project or we may have a backlog, and what we're trying to do is just see where is the best place where the items, opportunities are. So although we start in aporia, as a default, we may actually move different material into these different domains. So here we're saying that the approach is clear. Everyone can see and agree on what to do here. Items in this domain here, which is the complicated domain, are things where we need to do a bit of research, maybe consult an expert. Items in the complex domain is where even experts disagree, and we need to run some experiments here. And then finally, there's no known approach is immediately apparent. So that's the chaotic domain here. So although we may have lots of material initially at the start of a project or a particular situation, we are beginning to move things out into the different domains and manage them, or take opportunity and using the appropriate practice and mindset. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Thanks for sharing that, Dean.
Okay. Pause there in case there's any thoughts or questions, or if there's any housekeeping which needs to be addressed.
I think, Dean, there is a big help, but also a big challenge here, which is which actually I've put on LinkedIn a month ago or something, which I asked all these people, who know Cynefin framework, where do you place the COVID crisis at the moment, or maybe early stage and now, where do you place it on the Cynefin framework? And when you look at, I mean, my firm opinion is that if you look at the early stage, the countries that have worked best with the COVID crisis is the one that immediately treated this as chaotic. Because how can you, be better than just do anything kind of in chaotic? Well, it's the drill. It's like the fire drill. When, you know, when the alarm goes off, leave the building. Well, yes, but maybe the elderly lady on the 5th floor hasn't heard, so maybe I go up. No, you leave the building, and then we see where we can do something about the elderly lady. And so you have these prepared steps that you just run through because you have to be fast, and you know they are not perfect. You know there will be collateral damage when you do so, but the time that you gain by just acting on that at the beginning is so important in comparison to finding out, you know, what a really good solution would be, that's what you do. And when you look at Taiwan and South Korea, Singapore, I think also Hong Kong, all the countries that have managed to get now through the early phase and without having to go into lockdown, they had exactly a fire drill ready at the beginning of the COVID crisis based on their SARS experience. They run through this fire drill very fast and see where it got them. And yes, now we are in complex. Now we have to sense and to find out, you know, where are the numbers going? And yeah, we have imperfect measurements, and therefore we have to wait a little bit and see what happens. That's complex, yes. But the beginning, the countries that took it as chaotic as fast as possible, they were doing best.
And to add to that, I think eventually, sorry.
Maybe I'm still not clear about what chaotic is. For me, chaotic would be if I don't know what the cause is. If I take Bernard's example, I know it's a virus. I know it spreads from bionic to bionic, individual to individual. I'm not quite sure whether it spreads from animals or not, but I have a fairly good idea of what it is, right? It might have been chaotic at the beginning in China and Wuhan, but in my interpretation, what chaotic is, I'd rather classify it as complex, because no, we don't quite know what exactly and how fast, and we don't know what it actually does to the humans, and we don't know the lag phase between getting infected and showing symptoms. But we roughly know where that thing is, right? If people would start developing symptoms that I can't classify, and I have no idea where that comes from, I don't know whether it's a virus, a bacteria, or some sort of poisoning, for me that would be a chaotic response. And then we just go in all different directions and try all different random things to probe whatever that might be. But we in the West kind of knew it is a virus. We don't know the beast very, very clearly, but we have a fairly good idea. So yeah, I would put it into a complex domain.
Yeah, and that kind of goes in line with what you describe as exactive. You know, so we're going from, you know, an emergent place where we know almost where we need to go to an exactive where we're going to need to make a change, but we don't quite know what that change looks like, right?
I think you have to be careful in defining your system in focus. If your system in focus is the biology of it, you know, it's a virus. Oh, we even know it's a coronavirus and so on. Yes, of course, it's not in chaotic. But when you look at it from the point of view of spreading, then the knowledge that you need is who has got it, how fast does it transfer from one person to the other, where does it transfer, and so on. And there you have no idea at that moment.
But then that makes it more complicated, doesn't it? So you need to kind of sense, analyze, and respond.
No, because the only thing you know is it's all over the place. You know, you don't, when the football match in Bergamo is happening, you have no idea what's going on in terms of virus or spreading of the contagion there. When Singapore is closed, you know, even they learned something. Oh, we've got to close the borders to everybody coming in from China. They had no idea that people already coming in from Europe were actually carrying the virus. So we are talking on that level, not on understanding biology of how it works or understanding the science of how it works, but just finding the people who have it and doing the right thing with them. And if that is your, you know, what the government would do. So if that is your perspective, then you have no idea. You have no idea.
Does that suggest we go back into the chaotic phase in that quadrant then? So we're back in chaos again?
I think now not. because now we have a lot of ideas. We have a lot of ideas that, for example, apparently it is not wildly spreading outside of the cases that we have identified. For example, we have patterns. I usually make a difference between complex and chaotic in terms of, in complex, you have some kind of more or less stable patterns. Whereas in chaotic, these patterns, maybe in retrospect, you will find out there were some. But at the moment, when you have to react and respond to it, you can't see them. And so now we are in a phase where you have understood patterns, we have seen patterns, we realize in which, which are the hot areas of the countries where there is a lot of cases still going on, which are the ones where there are not few cases. And since people are not traveling a lot, this is not going to, remains, relatively stable. The chances of a complete surprise there are small at the moment, unless we let everybody travel again. And so we're talking about patterns and the famous dance phase that we have now. And I love this thing about early phase, the hammer phase, and now the dance phase, because the hammer phase is exactly the typical drill reaction. As I've heard the WHO epidemiologists say at one point, you have to be fast, and trying to be right and trying to be perfect is the biggest enemy of fast.
Yeah, I like
that's hammer. That's chaotic, as far as I know.
I like your way to say that we recognize very, very patterns, and I say I would ideal scenario. I mean, if nobody's moving. So, which means that technically it's like when you study physics, like let's assume that the air is not moving. Let's assume that we stay at home. But the reality is we never tried to understand how public transportation can work in a different way than 100% capacity. So the reality is we are in a chaotic scenario by the time we try to move for real forward. And the next step we do, they will fall down in chaotic scenario again. My 2 cents, but just because ideal scenarios don't match with the reality. Reality is much complicated, more chaotic than we probably thought.
There's actually a problem that I have with, or simply something that I decide to disagree with Dave on the use of the model, because Dave says this is both a epistemological model, so a model about how we perceive the reality, and an ontological model, how reality is. In the world that I come from, there is no ontological model, because every model is about perception and how you can, how you work with your perception. But anyway, when you work with the perception, you can say a lot of things. What we put in clear, if you take Dean's example of somebody pulling a beer, if you look at the right spot, what are like the slightest chances of having some bacteria, of a guy having touched the what do you call it, the faucet where the beer comes out an hour ago, and now this next guy who takes the beer actually is super allergic to only this little thing, and so you can't 100% include it. Yes, yet the assumption to work on the basis that this is clear is actually a good assumption to work on. And so when you take this, then you would say, what is the assumption that you, for example, as a government, place your policy decisions on? And policy decisions on is when it's chaotic, it's about, you have no idea about patterns. When it's complex, you have moving patterns, you have emerging patterns. When it's complicated, you have something which is rather stable. It's just very difficult to understand. That's why you need analysis. And when it's clear, it's stable and it's very easy to understand.
That would be an ideal scenario again, in my opinion, because government does not take actions based on the Canadian framework. That's another point.
No, I think this might be a good juncture to move into the breakout rooms, because this is a really fruitful, rich discussion. And I think now's an opportunity to have a bit of divergent thinking. So I'm just going to present, if it's all right, Chantal, is I'm just going to present the next slide, which will cue us up to going into our breakout areas.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, fantastic. So it will be quite interesting, and I'm quite excited to learn about this. getting you guys to think about, it doesn't have to be COVID, it could be other situations, or it could be something fictitious, it could be something that you have at a family level, work level, or organizational level. So what decisions should be made now? What decisions could or should be made later? So the decisions which should be made now are candidates for the first 4 domains, or decisions which could or should be made later. It's just that could be held in the Aporia space. So again, we can think about this at team level or our organizational level, perhaps from the business landscape, perhaps from healthcare or social care, government policy, or healthcare research. So these are 4 possible areas that in your breakout areas that you may want to focus on, or again, feel free to think about something else. And I'm going to have this slide up on the screen here. And on this slide here is going to be some examples that I've put together. There may be some better examples, just to get our bearings. So a team level. So going back 2 months, many of us were told to work from home. So that is something that we just needed to do straight away, do it now. Perhaps we can defer some decisions about how we're going to coordinate our project or our initiative. So perhaps we don't have to deal with that right now. We can do that once we're at home. An example here is that let's think about a small local shop, and a decision that they had to make, or it wasn't really a decision, something they had to do was to cease trading, close down the store. Then later, being in Aporia, they could consider options about how can we continue trading even though our shop is closed down. They may want to have a look at e-commerce. This may be something they've done for the very, very first time. Final example, government. So a couple of months ago, many countries were telling their citizens to go into lockdown, and there was a different level of policing and encouragement. And for some governments to protect employees' wages and protect the employer as well. For some countries, there was a financial support to try and mitigate as much as possible any rise in unemployment. So when the lockdown does ease, then hopefully the majority of people have a job to go back to. So that's a decision that many governments made immediately, but they deferred any decisions. They waited for information before knowing what to do regarding easing of the lockdown, which many countries are now moving into. So I provided some examples, and what I'd like to do, if it's okay with you, Chantal, is just divide up everybody.
Yeah.
So we have 11 people. How do you reckon we should divide up everyone?
So we'll divide it into 3 groups. So it'll be like 3 people per room. So I'll do that. It's an automatic thing. So this is quite exciting for us, everyone. We've not used breakout rooms before, but we've had a session that was demonstrating what this looks like, and I'm really excited to be using it. So, okay, if everyone's ready, we're going to just divide us out. So what we're going to do, what's going to happen is that we're going to move out of this Zoom environment, and we're going to be redirected into a different Zoom environment. So bear with me, I'm going to do it now. Are you moving out into rooms? I think you are, slowly.
Yeah, yeah.
And then Dean, you and I can choose where to join, I think.
I've been invited to breakout room 3, so I can join that one.
Okay, I will go into number 2.
Yeah, and then
making some notes.
Wow, so you're one of those amazing people who can just visualize notes straight away.
It was amazing. Unfortunately, I'm not, but it just helped me. Yeah, what Dean was saying.
Have you just done that now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome. Can you please take a picture of it afterwards? I'd love to share that with the team afterwards.
Yeah, awesome.
That was the first question, I think, wasn't it? The group.
Yes. Oh, come on, let's get ourselves to work.
Yeah, sure. I'll post it on the group, by the way.
Yes. Oh, that'd be amazing. Okay, so I'll leave you to do the board stuff. So, you know, what decisions can we make now then? So, should we use lockdown as an example? I think that's an easy way to kind of.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what were the things that you guys did immediately?
I think we already mentioned, I think the first thing we sort of did is we had a trial run of closing down the office and have everyone working from home for one day. And it was literally, it turned out like literally the day before it happened anyway. So it was like a Friday, and then we got an email like, yeah, please don't come back and just stay home. So I think that was the absolute first thing. And then, as you said, like we sort of panicked about, oh God, how are we going to organize ourselves? What tools do we need? And how do we communicate? Like that happened within, I guess, the first sort of 2 weeks of trying to figure that out, on get some, you know, something up and running, and planning ahead of what communications do we need to change? Do we need a longer stand up to have a chat, or, you know, all those kind of things.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Haroon, did you catch that?
Yeah, sorry, I was just getting my paper, but I got that already.
Well done.
It was COVID-19 as in the COVID bubble, but I got everything that you just mentioned. Very similar to me actually, because so where I work in my team, so are we doing it at team basis, organisation level, or are we just doing it?
Yeah, organizational level, yeah.
I think it applies to both, right? It's like the organization to figure out how to do this, and the teams need to figure out do this, and that together sort of. It needs to sort of together.
/ teams, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think very similar to you, Nicole. When COVID-19 happened, the office went into kind of like meltdown.
Yeah.
So blue. I don't know if you heard that, but did you do blue-green teams? Did you?
No, I've not heard that necessarily. No.
Okay, so in my situation, we had blue and green teams planning about a week beforehand.
Yeah.
We basically got advice to download Teams, because Teams is like the MS Teams apparently, and I think Zoom another like another kind of configuration. So we got advice to download all of these MS Teams stuff, go to blue green stuff. We got advice to focus on our health and well-being. I don't know if you got that, but
oh yeah, we got tons of that. Like we get overloaded with well-being and yoga and all these kind of things, and I'm like, I do have a life. It's just I cannot spend I mean, it turned out I have to spend 10 hours a day in front of Zoom, which is not necessarily my preferred way of working.
It as well. It's really tiring to do that.
Yeah, it is. Like I have actually, like the biggest problem I have is like my eyesight. I can feel that it had a big impact, and I can't go anywhere. I can't check it out. So that's slightly scary, because I can see it's affecting me. So yeah, I'm.
So I'll share from a New Zealand perspective. I work in an essential services, which is energy providing. So the first thing when we heard about it was the company decided they would split, and they were looking at 2 teams. So one team at home, one team at the office to distribute that risk. Then within 2 days we were in lockdown, complete lockdown, and all working from home. But because we've been working from home, lots of people, it was a culture that was built into the organisation. It was not really a problem for us to work from home. Even our call centres people, they were all working from home, no problem. So it was really awesome for that. Now that we've gone back down to level 2 in New Zealand, and it's back to the 50-50 split of the teams to take the risk away. But also in the essential parts like the actual power stations, they collaborated with staff there, and the staff decided they'd stay on site. So they've actually spent 4 to 6 weeks on site. So yeah, there was
actually like sleeping there, like camping on site. Oh wow!
Like the company provided camper vans and things there, so power stations can keep running, and yeah,
you don't want anything happening to that right? Like that's scary shit. Like there's a lot of stuff we don't want to see on the news, that the power stations are now in danger. Like that's the next disaster we don't need. So yeah, definitely. But that's amazing.
New Zealand did quite well though. I think, you know, you guys locked down quite early, and so you know, from what I've heard, you've got a good.
But we've only got 5 million people to worry about, so it's a little bit easier than some of the other countries.
Yeah, I mean, London is more than that, right? So London itself is more than that.
Is that the population of Australia?
No, New Zealand.
So New Zealand, Greg.
Yeah, it's only
Wow.
only just turned 5 million.
Okay.
Wow. So one thing that I ended up finding myself doing, so I'm used to working from home, and what I had is a lot of the clients were sort of asking about tools, and you know, what can we do about tools? How can we kind of coordinate ourselves? So one of the things I found myself doing was actually sharing remote tools.
Yeah.
Very quickly. You know, so things like Slack. So what do you do for communication? What do you do for tracking your work? What do you do for, I can't even remember now, collaboration? And that actually proved really, really powerful for a lot of people on LinkedIn, for example. You'll probably see, if you see on my posts, that, you know, it got shared crazy. And I thought that was something that was really valuable. And I think it still stands today. Tooling is something that really came to the surface at this point. So
I think the most awakening was like we did, like for example, my company, we use Slack and all of that. We used it before, and as you said, we also worked partly from home, so it wasn't nothing new. It was just that everyone all of a sudden is home, which is slightly different. But then what became really fast an issue was that, for example, on Zoom or on various collaboration tools, we only had limited free access, or the kind of like freebie kind of solution. We really did not had the full-on 1,000 people solution, and so therefore that became, it's like, oh shit, now everyone needs a pro account, and everyone needs to, like, for example, Miro is a basic tool. Like
that was such a big
that now has become this now is essential. Like we can't work without it, which definitely did not happen beforehand. But
Miro did something very clever, because
yes, exactly.
They had red whiteboard, didn't they?
They adapted massively quickly to the demand of what they have. The same with Slack. And Zoom, they put out new features like nothing, and which is really impressive, which is really cool. But again, it's like it obviously that kind of thing my company did not really thought beforehand. So it was like within the first week, like, oh my god, like how are we going to get that all in place? And that took a bit of time. And
but what that is though is problem solving becoming aware, right? So there's a sudden need for things.
Yeah, exactly.
And people jumping on to solve those problems for people.
Yeah,
but not only that, I think there was that sudden realization that you could change quickly. Change is possible. And you know, for me, like one of my biggest pain points with organizations has been change. You know, to get things moving, to get things changing has been quite a challenge. But actually, suddenly out of the blue, this virus comes along, and suddenly everyone's okay with changing. And I found
that's the main thing, right? I always say to my teams, like, sometimes it just takes an earthquake to move a mountain, and I let the earthquake happen because I can see it coming. But in order to get you all along, I'm just going to let it happen. So, you know, they're accepting that something needs to change.
Yeah,
that's far better than if I tell them, well, I could fix your problem right now, but that's not going to fix it. So
no, this is it. So my alarm has just gone off, and so it's
you need to go back.
I have to go back.
I love the fish tank, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I was just saying that's my team behind me.
Fishies are blocked with the Post-its. I love that.
Yeah, love the Post-it notes on the fish tank.
Right, we're going to head back, but that was really good. Thank you, Haroon, for taking those notes. That's great.
Hi, you're welcome.
Speak to you on the other side.
You bet.
I'm on mute. Okay, I think everyone should be on their way back, hopefully. Hopefully they've not left us and I've not broken it.
Peter, can I just quick check something? You mentioned about welcoming change, right? So as in change being a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, it's a good thing. It's a good thing. It's that realization that change can be possible. And so, you know, all the others that have actually turned around and said, oh no, it's not possible, we can't do this, have suddenly found themselves in a situation where they're forced to do it, which actually proves that this is possible, it can be done.
Yeah.
So we've got 7 seconds, 5 seconds left. Everyone should be on their way back.
It was like time traveling.
Isn't it? What's going on?
That's a new killer Zoom feature. They really want people to go to the premium feature set. Now includes time travel.
Let's have another run. Come on.
Everyone back? Is everyone back?
It's like the fleet coming back from hyperspace, you know.
Yeah.
I like it.
I'm a bit confused now because I've got this, I don't know if you can see, you can't see my screen, but Sven, you're back. Russell, you're back. Dean, you're back.
Yeah.
Everyone's back. Okay, great.
We're thinking about the time. I think we're hoping to close at the top of the hour, aren't we, Chatal? So
I'm okay if everyone else is okay. How's everyone else doing for time?
Perhaps what we can do is just go around to each group and at least give them some time to share their thinking, and maybe they've got some examples that they may want to share.
Yep.
So how about Haroon? You're doing some illustrations there. Do you want to go first? Does your group want to go first? What group number were you? Do you remember?
Yeah, we were in breakout room number 2. I was with Greg, Nicole, and Cheetah. So I'm just thinking, Greg, Nicole, and Cheetah, shall I kind of put the camera here and you can tell the story maybe?
Well, you're not listening. Kidding. Yeah, Nicole, do you want to go first?
Gosh. Yeah, so we were discussing of kind of what we did first, and that was basically you said there. So yeah, basically the whole office sort of just got, basically we got the announcement of just you have to stay home, that's it. And then we had to find ourselves with finding tooling and the Microsoft Teams there, experimenting with Teams, what works and what doesn't. And Craig was explaining that actually from his side, what happened within lockdown, that one team, a whole group of people decided to actually stay, because he works in a power station, to actually stay in the power station and camp there, which I find it's actually amazing that people are willing to sort of do that to secure everyone's, because electricity is important, right? We don't want that thing to blow off when we're all home and need more electricity than we ever needed before. So I think that's a really amazing story there. And and then we started sharing. The first thing we sort of did was we started thinking about well-being, health, sharing different tools for remote working, figuring out how we get all access to all these tools. We've identified needs we just never knew existed, or that we would need, for example, a pro Zoom account to handle all the meetings we have all day long. So so that was the kind of challenges. Chitay, want to add anything?
We added to that, didn't we? That one of the things I was just wrapping up to was saying that change, when you actually embark on a transformation, almost change is such a difficult thing to achieve. But in this instance, one virus actually forced people to change in ways that they thought were not possible, which was really, really nice to see in a way. Greg, did you want to add anything?
Just that, so before we went into full lockdown, and now that we're at level 2, it's a 50-50 split of staff to de-risk the situation.
Yeah, and that was kind of a nice gradual way of easing back into the workplace as well, which is always interesting to know.
Just a brief observation for me was that all of this stuff was happening in the Aporia world, a state of being, puzzled, confused, and almost sometimes waiting for decisions to be made. I don't know what people think or what the general consensus at this stage, but I find that maybe Aporia is a bit of everything. Sometimes where you think you're in Aporia, but actually you could use some of the other sense-making decision models from the other domains in order to find yourself or navigate through that mist, maybe. So like the complex domain where it's more of a experimental, emergent nature of making decisions can also be probably applied in the Aporia world. I don't know. I don't know what people's perceptions are, but I feel that it's quite helpful.
What about the others?
Should we move on to another group? Was that everyone in group 2?
Yeah.
Yeah. How about group 1? I guess Tim, Stephen, Michelangelo, were you in group 1?
Bernard, you synthesizes perfectly, actually, the sessions. What do you think?
Just hand it over the top. Well, let me start with at the end. I think we had this kind of conversation going on. We were talking about co-location versus working from home, and that maybe it's when it started, nobody had really an idea of how much difference working from home would make. Now, when you don't talk about the technical part, but just about how important is it to be co-located. And depending on the kind of work that you have, you might discover that it's there is much less difference from working from home on your computer than working in an office building on your computer. And that this is kind of a learning process. At the same time, we took this as a learning to find out, well, how important it is to carefully define what is the system that you're talking about. So, for example, we just in the conversation, it popped up. When we talk about this can be the case for a team that is working and having this experience. Now, as soon as you introduce the possibility that you will have new recruits in an onboarding process coming in, the whole thing changes. Because now, if you think about how long does it take and how difficult it's going to be in an onboarding process for somebody to come up to speed and start interacting and working, because that person doesn't have the co-location experience and the informal ways of making the connections that you already have in that team. So the team, before they have the first recruit, they will naturally not include that in the system focus that they're talking about. But when you think in long term and make decisions on how are we going to deal with that and so on, you have to be very careful and say, oh, this is going to come up, in the future years. This is going to come up, so we have to consider this. So that was kind of the last learning we had in the conversation. Don't know what else maybe other people in the team want to share from what we've talked about.
I liked your example of the dishwasher, Bernard. I don't know if you want to share that with everyone, whether they've heard that or not.
Okay, I'll repeat it. Well, that's actually from Dave. So I've participated in an online event from Dave, and I just had a huge success with using this metaphor in all conversations about what do you do with COVID, which adds something about, because I believe it's about Aporia. Dave hasn't used it in that connection, but I think it goes in that connection. The idea is this: if you think about, you have an empty dishwasher, you have breakfast, you want to stack your stuff. If you just think about the situation now, how to get stuff in there, you just do it in one way or another. It doesn't matter, there's a lot of space. But usually none of us do that. We all think, well, there will be later moments when we put stuff in. And how can we put our breakfast things now in a way that we will not have to rearrange later on? Now, when you think about it, you don't know exactly how many pans will be there and how many plates and stuff. And so you don't know that. So there is an opening in terms of what is coming in the future. And yet there are better ways to start stacking your dishwasher, like edges inwards and same to same and so on. And there are more, less intelligent way of doing that, where the probability is high that later on you will have to restack your stuff. And so this is the same thing. So when you talk about, we talked about with Dean's example about Aporia being something where you wait, you hold some decisions until later when you know more and when you've actually placed your situation in one of the other domains. But I think something is also, what decisions can we make so that no matter what of the more or less probable futures will arrive, it will be quite a good decision. And that's a question I think is very worthwhile.
So I like that example. So with the dishwasher example, if we were in Aporia, would we not choose to stack those items in the dishwasher or just leave them on the kitchen counter?
No. What you stack them in a way which is a good idea or a good solution, almost no matter what will come later.
Mm-hmm.
So it's
you
almost
consider,
like,
you know, it's kind of, if you think strategy work, a lot of classical strategy work is, let's find out what is exactly the scenario that will most probably happen, do the perfect solution for that, but in case that we will have another scenario and this is not going to come out true, we're in big trouble.
So we're creating, we keep
the opposite of that. We say, how can we do something which is quite, maybe not perfect for any of these scenarios, but quite good in almost all the scenarios that are thinkable in the future.
So it seems like we're trying to keep as many options open as possible.
Absolutely, yes. But we take decisions, we do things.
or we just buy a really good dishwasher that actually has all the parts set up for us.
Can I have ask a question for the dishwasher example? I don't think there are negative implications for not following the maybe more timely fashion of stacking the dishwasher in a, let's say, precise way. And we can't foresee whether there are any negative consequences of taking the time and stacking the dishwasher in a timely fashion. In an accurate way, right? So we have the luxury to spend the time to make a decision what we believe is accurate without feeling any punishment, right? It doesn't seem like there's a wrong way how to come out of this.
Oh yes, I believe there is. So the idea is that what is important is that you shouldn't have to restock your breakfast stuff to make space for the dinner stuff later. So for example, if you say, let me put in a plate and then leave 4 of these things empty and then put another plate and then have another 4 empty and another plate, this will be no problem if you have enough other plates coming in. But if you have a pan coming in, it won't go. So you have to put all the plates together and then you have enough space for a pan. So putting all the plates together from the beginning is good when you have other plates coming, and it's also good when you have a pan coming. Putting the plates with an interval of quite a few is good when the plates are coming, but when a pan is coming, it's not good.
Yeah, and I can vouch for that. My pans don't get washed if I don't put it in properly.
Greg, you unmuted yourself and you look like you're about to share something. Did you want to share something?
I still think that Aporia has like a pause state before we decide where we're going to go.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an example to build on that, or a thought?
I just think in all examples, like even the dishwasher one, if we're in a hurry, we just stack it, right? So it's the situation that makes us go a particular direction. If we have particular dishes we want to get washed in a particular way, we'll stack it more carefully and stuff like that. So I think but it's about this. It's the awareness of a situation drives us to where it's like a pause to become aware.
Could I add to that?
Yep.
I think it's introducing the time. Basically, it's introducing time for decision making. And as a result, we're now talking about almost like options analysis. There's a risk of this and time for this and time for that, and stacking up different options, and they could have different costs. It's opening up a whole different sort of avenue rather than it be black and white. So it's kind of changing our term of reference and almost pulling it out to include the time, but it's being quite subtle about it.
Yeah, I think, yeah, go on, Ross.
We got that as well. We figured that the action from in Aporia is wait. You know, this is the state where you can sit there as long as you like and you wait. Whereas, you know, we revisited with Sven, you know, the difference with chaos, and chaos demands action. You know, you do something.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we agreed with that. We found the time dimension really crucial here.
So I wonder if resilience, there's a relationship between resilience and being in Aporia. If we think about an organization, the more cash reserves it has, the more it can benefit from time before the cash reserves are drained and they're forced to make a decision.
Oh, yeah.
Or if we think about, we've mentioned options and optionality before, the more optionality we have, the more perhaps we feel comfortable in Aporia. So I'm not sure if there's a relationship between resilience and Aporia.
I think maybe it's whether the Aporia is self-imposed or not. We were talking about the example where with COVID, everyone was we acted and everyone worked from home. And now we're kind of in Aporia, kind of waiting to see what companies will do when lockdown is lifted, offices could reopen, whether people will go back to how they were before, or whether actually we'll treat it as a complex adaptive system and do some probing. But it feels at the moment it's we're in Aporia, but it's kind of enforced. It's not our choice. And I think what you're talking about there with the cash reserves is that's a boundary, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess many governments have tried to address the depleting cash reserves of organisations and individuals and families by putting in place tax breaks and various different support, so people don't feel desperate, and therefore they'll remain in lockdown for as long as possible.
But I think there's two elements. So again, you know, Dean, this is something we discussed yesterday, and I hope it's okay to discuss it now. But ultimately, there was one scenario that I was faced with, for example, and that scenario was basically around the idea that I had flights booked to go away, and suddenly lockdown happened. Obviously, there was no chance we were going to go away, and there was nothing I could do about it at that point in time, because I think I was comfortable in knowing that later on I could deal with it, which meant that I could deal with what's happening in front of me right this moment in time. And that was the actual, you know, locking yourselves in and, you know, doing the kind of obvious kind of coordinating things from working from home, for example. So that was the first thing we did. But then actually going back and claiming the refunds or the vouchers for the flights, that could have happened later. So I think from that perspective, you can be in a state of Aporia where you react now, but also there's things you can do later on as well.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you, Haruna, and that's what I was kind of meaning that, you know, I don't know if this is the right thinking or not from my perspective, but as in when you're in a state of Aporia, it's almost you can make multiple decisions, as in some of those being wait time, and I think going back to Dean's kind of and Stephen's comment there about wait time. You know, is that organisation, does it have the cost? Does it have, can it reserve the cash? Can it, is that cost of delay or cost of waiting? Does it have that, or how much of that does it have in order to make that decision and make a sound enough decision to get to the next state, whatever state they need to get to? Yeah, I agree with you on that one.
I would just like to emphasize that you know, I think if we focus too hard on the behavior in Aporia being to wait and not decide, that's one-sided. That's one option. But the other is really about making these decisions that keep open a lot of options. I'm just, you know, apart from the dishwasher, I'm just constructing an example in my head. Imagine that a friend invites you for, I don't know, a weekend or Sunday hike or something. It's just like, hey, there's a trip. We meet somewhere quite far away. So you have to get there, and they say there will be some walking, but not only, the rest is a surprise. How do you dress? You know, do you put on the heavy hiking shoes? Is it, you know, it could go up in the mountains and it's going to be cold. It can stay down. It's going to be hot. So now you say, okay, I want to dress in a way which can deal with as many of these options that we're going to have. You dress, you go there. So that's a lot of decisions and actions. But the kind of good decisions that you take is not best for the mountains, but not good for the lakes or whatever, but good for, sufficiently good for anything that you could imagine that's going to happen there. But
layering. I think layering is the answer.
But one thing I would questioning here, what I find, so we said earlier that it's a state of puzzlement and doubt. And what you just described there, me going to see a friend somewhere in the woods or forest, yes, I might be puzzled what kind of clothes I take, but then I go back to what I have learned previously, which is known to me and which is simple in a way that I know that might be raining, I know it might be hot, I know I will do certain activities, so therefore I cover 3 or 4 different outfits as such, because that's best practices, because that's what I know. So therefore, it's not, I don't feel like that's a state of puzzlement or doubt, because yes, it's doubt as in I don't know exactly which one of those, but I know highly likely I might need all of them because we're in UK and the weather's awful. So I'm not quite sure where that example fits in with what you just described.
Well, an example of what I think Bernard was saying was if you just paused and didn't do anything, you'd go out naked, and we wouldn't want that, right?
Well, I guess before
so
that,
you would actually put some clothes on, so that would be a action that you would do.
Okay.
So you know, definitely,
right?
definitely do something.
To go out without clothes on because we know that's not appropriate, at least. So, and we could end up somewhere else we don't want to be. So, isn't that something we know no matter what?
So,
yeah, I still think it's situation driven a little bit.
So on that note, though, going with what we know, to leverage on what I was talking about before with the flight details. So what I was booked on a flight with British Airways, for example, and in a nutshell, they were in a state of aporia. They knew that they were about to, economically, they were really going to be affected, and they knew that. So actually, they leveraged the state of aporia, and they said, right, okay, so rather than hand out refunds, we're going to give everyone who's booked a flight on our services a voucher. So actually, by being in that state of aporia, you can actually be very clever with it as well. What do you think about that?
I mean, that works for them as a business. That does not necessarily provide the best customer service, given that some people no longer have any funds to go anywhere and actually would have needed the money to cope with the situation. So I guess that would be my take on it.
Yeah.
But I see the invention to save my business. But then is that best customer service? Not too sure. At least you should have the option, right? But yeah.
It's a response, isn't it, to aporia?
Well, the question is what customer service is going bankrupt.
Yeah.
Just looking at the time, we've hit the top of the hour, Chantal.
Yeah.
And we've already got a message from Tim here saying he's having to drop off. Thank you, Tim, for joining us. Thank you so much. I think Nicole's got to go as well. Perhaps it's best if we do wrap up and any closing remarks, or just call it a day or call it a night.
Yeah, so I think it's been a really insightful talk today, and it's really got me thinking about how I can talk about aporia in front of a lot of different organisations as well. So I think it's really interesting what's going on here.
Yeah, thank you. Any final thoughts? Any quick closing thoughts, guys?
Hi guys, Haruna. Just a quick one actually. Thanks both Chantal, Dean, and everyone on the group. By the way, really, very helpful in terms of insights. Where else can we find stuff about aporia, Dean? Is there any links?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the reminder. If I will reshare my screen because there's a link to the deck, and in that deck there's links to various documents. Just bear with me. I'm going to reshare my screen, and I'll go to the final slide.
Could you add it to the meetup? I don't because
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Yeah, I'll also this will be recorded. As you know, it's recorded, so you can always refer back to this video as well.
Thanks, guys. Really good session. Thanks a lot.
My last insight that it's got more questions than answers, so it's definitely in the puzzlement area.
Yeah, it's good to see that it's been extended though, so there is an iterative angle to the Cynefin framework, and it is growing and changing and scaling to the times. And I think that's always a really interesting thing when it comes to tools and frameworks within the Agile space. I mean, you know, they've got to practice what they preach and learn to evolve themselves. So that is really nice to see that.
Okay.
All right, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
All the best. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and see you soon.
See you, Sita.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.